Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the Young Men's Bible Class from First Presbyterian Church here in Greensboro. I'm Lane Ridenhour, and I thank you for joining us online as we gather together for worship and study on this Sunday, May 30th, 2021. We hope you'll also join us for our sanctuary service at 10 o'clock a.m. Just go to our website, www.fpcgreensboro.org, and you'll find the link for the service, as well as a link where you can download our service bulletin. Our Sunday school teacher, Sandie Gravett, is beginning a brand new video series this morning. It's titled, What 2020 Has Taught Us About Being a 21st Century Church. It's sort of a look at what the church can and perhaps should be during this time of change. Well, this is Memorial Day weekend. We hope you're enjoying that, but it's also worth pointing out that today is Trinity Sunday, the first Sunday after Pentecost, and we celebrate the mystery of God in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Unlike other festival days in the church year, interestingly enough, Trinity Sunday celebrates a doctrine rather than a person or an event. Our hymn this morning is a hymn that was written for Trinity Sunday. It was written by Reginald Heber in 1826. It's Holy, Holy, Holy. Heber was an Anglican priest in an obscure little parish in Hudnet, Shropshire, England. He wrote some 57 hymns, a collection of rather high-caliber hymns that corresponded to events in the church year. Ironically, at that time, the Anglican Church didn't allow these hymns to be sung, and they weren't even published until after his death. The elegant and stately hymn tune that has become associated with Heber's text is named Nicaea, in honor of the Council of Nicaea, where the doctrine of Trinity was first shaped. This hymn was written by John Bacchus Dietz, the music that is, the choir director of Durham Cathedral in Durham, England. The hymn Holy, Holy, Holy was a favorite of Dr. John A. Redhead Jr., who was senior minister here at First Presbyterian Church for some 25 years. And it was the opening hymn here each week for many of those years. As usual, I'll put the words up on the screen for you and invite you to sing along with me. Holy, Holy, Holy.
Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, early in the morning our song shall rise to Thee. Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God in three persons, blessed Trinity. Holy, 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 all the saints adore Thee, casting down their golden crowns around the glassy sea. Cherubim and seraphim falling down before Thee, who wert and art and evermore shalt be. Holy, 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 though the darkness hide Thee, though the eye of sinfulness Thy glory may not see, only Thou art holy, there is none beside Thee, perfect in power, in love and purity. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, all Thy works shall praise Thy name in earth and sky and sea. Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God in three persons, blessed Trinity.
Here we are at Memorial Day, the official start of summer, and with the pandemic restrictions easing up, people are going to be a little bit more mobile. As a result, I wanted to do a series this summer that did not necessarily build week to week, but still had a common theme. What I plan to talk about is the way that the year 2020 can shape the 21st century church. A few years back, we did a series on some of the changes we anticipated in the church based on what demography and a few other factors showed us about how Christianity was unfolding. While some of that information is still on track, 2020 changed our American reality and the world in ways that we are still going to have to take a good deal of time and space to fully understand. I would say that 2020 ended up being what we call an inflection point. That is, we had an event, or a series of events really, that touched off significant change. Now, while the depth and breadth of that change is difficult to assess, since we are at least still waist deep in many of the challenges that 2020 threw at us, if we want to make the best choices about adjusting to these changes, responding to those changes, reflecting those changes, it is never too early to give it thought. And the season of Pentecost is the ideal time for such an effort, since it is a season meant for thinking about the growth and the expansion of the church. Let me start this series with an obvious choice. COVID threw many of us for a loop that we never saw coming, and few of us probably have any kind of a realistic grip on the global impact we are still seeing unfold. We all know from experience, however, that COVID changed the way that we did church. But just how deeply that change goes, how lasting it will be, is still an emerging situation. But here is my first theme, something for thought. If 2020 taught us anything, it taught us that the church is not a building. It might seem like an obvious point, but let's think through it in terms of what it means for the 21st century church at this moment, rather than doing what too many have already done and overdone by reporting on the challenges of COVID for worship communities, or whether the government should be able to mandate religious groups not gathering. I want instead to take us to 3 biblical places in order to contemplate why this opportunity is important and to help us reorient our perspective on what the church is. First, we will go to the examples of losing both the first and the second temples. Second, we will go to the paradigm of Jesus' ministry. And third, we will go to the ideal of the church as a body of believers. Number 1, the analogy to the loss of the temple in Jerusalem in 587-86 BCE to the Babylonians, and then in 70 CE to the Romans, might not appear an obvious place to go to learn about a moment 2,500 years later in the first instance, and 1,950 years or so since the second. But these crises shifted the practice of worship among the community that would become the Jews in the first instance, and that was the Jewish world in the second. And they did so in ways that continue to be instructive in our time. When it stood, the temple was, no doubt, important to the people of Israel, particularly those in the city of Jerusalem. It was, however, as much a symbol of their nation as of their God. There was not even an attempt to separate religion and politics. During the monarchy, the temple stood right beside the palace and was a sign of divine favor on a human king, as well as the national treasury. It legitimated political power, much as our White House and our Congress do today. The ideology that held that God was the source and the strength of the ruler, and the temple being used to symbolize that relationship of God, king, and nation, was what we need to be thinking about. During the Second Temple period, and in an acute way during the Roman occupation, the temple was a focal symbol for two divergent aims. For some people, the temple was a beacon, encapsulating the aspirations and the hopes for the reestablishment of the nation. For others, it was a sign of corruption and collaboration of the elite in the Jewish world with the occupiers, and it needed a radical transformation at best. Don't be too shocked by these assessments. The divine right of kings has been a dominant political model for much of human history, and many religions supported such ideals. We can easily forget that temples, like other grand religious buildings, were the business of the more wealthy and powerful in society. Their size and their stature and their grandeur speaks volumes about power. I make this point to remind us that the temple doesn't function precisely like what we think of when we consider today's churches, not even the closest equivalent, which might be something like St. Peter's Basilica in Rome for Roman Catholics. And yet the stories of its destruction are nonetheless instructive to us. While power and privilege circulated around the temple and its environs, it was still a place where many folks from a variety of walks of life and from all over the region would go. They would attend festivals there. They would come to make sacrificial efforts. It was a vehicle that helped them commit to a structure of governance that was about identity as a people and possession of a particular land. Thus, when the first temple was destroyed, and many people overall, but especially among the elites, experienced exile in Babylon, there was some decision-making to be done. What else could hold together a diverse band of people spread out over a large region without some sense of nationhood? And if God was going to be center stage of that effort, what does worship of this God look like away from a temple? Even more, what does it offer if it doesn't offer a land and a king? It is no accident that the leadership in exile began to write and produce the Torah in this period. The book they made, the story they told, became the centerpiece of the community rather than a building. And unlike the temple, that book could go all kinds of places. It was easier to carry with them wherever they landed. This was an enormous shift. It was an inflection point. It is in the years that follow the production of the Torah that we begin to see synagogues emerging, not only as centers of study of that text, but also as community gathering places, community centers in towns where people could have easily disappeared into the larger milieu of gathered folks with all of their different religious traditions. In short, the community figured out ways to keep the identity of the people intact and to construct supportive institutions even if it didn't look like what they had been doing before. Although the rebuilding of the temple by the Persians and its presence once it was reestablished was an important piece in the life of the emerging Jewish community on the regional level, we have to recognize something. Many people lived as a part of the community of Israel and never saw the temple. The God whose presence it symbolized was not simply made manifest there, but that God was also present in practices and ways of living wherever they happened to be. Thus, while the destruction of the temple that second time was traumatic, it didn't touch off the same kind of a crisis response, because the adaptations made the first time were already working to ensure the survival of the people. Instead, what happened in 70 CE was the emergence of a form of rabbinic Judaism that persisted throughout much of the history of the Jewish people from that day forward. Now, where I see the likeness to our situation today is in this dual kind of crisis. When 2020 started, we already had churches in steep attendance declines in the United States, as they had been in Europe for some time. But while many church leaders had been focused on how to keep their doors open and to maintain their traditions, we were missing some of the larger cross currents that were fueling the decline. I would point to this one thing today. Many of the functions that churches traditionally served locally had been displaced by other institutions. The need to enjoy music or art, to practice mindfulness or social responsibility, to teach ethics and values, to think about the questions of the day, or to ponder the deep questions of life, to take care of the needs of others in the community. All of these things can and are being accomplished effectively and efficiently in other venues. Thus, when the pandemic lockdowns came, statistics tell us that church attendance dropped by 1/3 in the United States. From March to July of 2020, many people did not migrate to online or drive-up or outdoor options. Now at present, as more church reopenings have been happening, the figures are less certain. There are some reports that attendance is approaching pre-pandemic levels, which again, we shouldn't forget were already sharply down and dropping fast. Other assessments paint a little bit more of a pessimistic picture. But one thing hasn't changed, and that is the core vision issue. What the church is offering people that they cannot get any place else more effectively and efficiently in another venue remains unsolved. Like the people living in the wake of the destruction of the first temple, we have to find a compelling vision to build something different that offers people options for being part of a community that works with their lives as they are being lived now. One way to kick off the process of reflecting on what that vision might be is this one. We should be asking ourselves, what adaptations were made as a community during the time of COVID that were good and maybe should stick around in some form? I think of this kind of reflection as being similar to what my teaching colleagues are doing. Many were firmly opposed to teaching online in any form prior to COVID, and then we all got cast into that world. Now I hear these words frequently. Well, while I prefer the face-to-face classroom, there are a lot of things I am keeping from my online experience because they actually work better for what I'm trying to achieve. We need to be asking ourselves, what were those successes as a church that we might need to maintain in order to reach different audiences, meet different needs? What are some new ideas we might want to introduce in this phase of being the church? And how do they relate to our vision of who we are in this time and in this place? How can we promote those conversations about who we are and who we want to be? That is, how do we begin to think about that visioning work? That leads me to my second point. Jesus, by all accounts, spent the vast majority of his ministry in the Galilee, not in Jerusalem and not at the temple. If you read the Gospel of John, he makes 3 trips to Jerusalem during his ministry. If you read the Synoptic Gospels, it's once. But in the Gospels, we do see Jesus popping in and out of synagogues. What was he doing there? Luke 4:31 and following is one famous story where we see Jesus teaching in these places. In that story, it goes on to say he's in the synagogue and rebukes an unclean spirit. And that action, the text concludes, earns him some acclaim. It says, and a report about him began to reach every place in the region. That is, Jesus is making the local news. People are talking about him. We could add to his list of synagogue activities, and I would encourage you to read the Gospels with questions about what Jesus was doing in those appearances in mind. But consider this. Jesus was only in those synagogues one day out of every week. We know that he was not simply teaching and healing and rebuking unclean spirits, however, one day out of the week. We know that the majority of Jesus' ministry and his efforts were out and around meeting people in private homes and in public spaces like roadways, out in fields. Wherever he happened to be, there was ministry happening. In short, Jesus gives us a pattern for ministry I think of as relevant in 2 ways. Yes, the synagogue was a community, and it was a place where people met to study and pray and be together. And yes, Jesus used interactions there to reach groups and to spread his message. We should not, as he did not, give up on the building. But number 2, Jesus' actions there were also a challenge to what was traditionally done in those kinds of spaces. Look at Mark 3, which shows a healing in such a place and how Jesus affects a controversy. It says he was in the synagogue and there was a man who had a withered hand. They were watching Jesus to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath in order to accuse him. And so he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come on, come forward." And then he said to all those people watching him, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" Nobody answered him. And he got mad, and he told the man, "Reach out your hand." And the man did it, and his hand was restored. And then it says they go out conspiring how to destroy him. Jesus is pushing at the norms of what can happen on the Sabbath, but also what should be happening in that particular place, in the synagogue. I find this useful because if 2020 showed us anything, it showed us that where people were struggling, where people were in need of healing, was not something that we necessarily identify with the church. We have to reckon with the fact that we tend to like our community work to be focused on big opportunities, dedicating an occasional day to building a habitat home or doing a hunger walk, going on a mission trip. We have to ask ourselves, are there smaller and more focused daily or weekly opportunities to be the people of God, to meet the needs of people? And can they be associated with our buildings? I would mention just a few of the COVID crisis issues: childcare, food insecurity, support for children's learning. These are all opportunities where we might be able to affect change. We might also want to think about this. Can the church be a place like Jesus showed us, where difficult community conversations are happening? Can we welcome the opportunity to talk through our values and to help people look critically at issues we say matter, coming to terms with issues that raise our blood pressure and make our pulses race? It is an age-old formula in many ways. Meet needs, address challenges, and people will come. But doing that work pushes us in a third way. I would say it's this. The 21st century church needs us to be a body, not a building. 2020 demanded that we think more expansively about this idea. Most of us understand that the pandemic doesn't finish when North Carolina or any other state drives down its rate of infection. It does not finish when one nation, like the United States, has a low daily positivity rate, or diminishes the possibility of death or serious repercussions from contracting the disease through vaccination. Why doesn't it end there? Because as long as other places are struggling, we are struggling. We are not separate from the world. We are interconnected. We are interconnected locally, by county, by region, by state. We are interconnected nationally, and we are interconnected across national borders and around the globe. Let's just think of one example. The devastation that COVID is causing in India should be horrifying to us on a human level. We also understand, however, that it has repercussions for us directly. As long as variants are spreading around, they have the potential to move across the globe rapidly. And we could see the effects because we can't shut ourselves off from the rest of the world. We are a global human body, and when one suffers, the others suffer in some way. It reminds me of a biblical passage. Now I know that Paul was talking about the church specifically in 1 Corinthians 12, but I could not help but stop at this particular section. He says, "The eye cannot say to the hand, 'I have no need of you,' nor again the head to the feet, 'I have no need of you.' On the contrary, the members of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable." I'm going to skip down a bit. God has so arranged the body that there may be no dissension within the body, but that members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together with it. If one member is honored, all rejoice together with it. It's a profound passage reminding us that we as Christians don't exist within a vacuum in our local building. We are part of a larger Christian fellowship, and our ministry extends to the larger human community. How should this knowledge influence us when we think about the 21st century church? We have to begin by recognizing a demographic quirk in the expression of Christianity here in the U.S. Are you aware that the majority of Christians in this country are well educated? College graduates show up in the church pews more often in nearly every kind of Christian tradition. Some of that fidelity among the educated is residual because of the graying of the church. Older college grads are the majority in many congregations. But what that helps us put our hands around is that while we are seeing fewer and fewer folks in multiple economic categories coming into our church, two of the biggest drop-off populations are people with a high school education or less and younger people. Those data points just happen to coincide with lower income ranges in our communities. And it's no accident that this is happening at a time when we are experiencing a greater wealth gap than we have at most points in American history for American families, the prime audience that the church is ready to speak to. COVID hurt us here in ways that I don't have time to unpack today. But here is my point. An older, more educated, wealthier, and in many cases, white church population cannot grow unless and until it figures out how to think about being a body, and a body that recognizes who here is included and who here isn't represented. And also recognizes that in the world, Christianity is growing most quickly in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America. If we're going to build a body, we have to be in coalition with these groups. Buildings, as we have seen, can all too easily sit empty and idle. Bodies are out working together, being the people of God. So where do we finish today? 2020 was a hard year, but it was also an opportunity to break from our well-established routines of being the church and to learn to be the church differently. Here are a few questions I would encourage you to consider. When we took that time away, what did we recognize that we were missing? What things did we figure out were no longer really all that useful to us and we can discard? What did we manage to do differently that worked? But perhaps most important of all, who do we want to be going forward? Do we want to be a building or a body? And what does that mean if we choose the latter? Thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoy the Memorial Day weekend, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week.